Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast, a podcast about stage musicals that have been legally filmed and publicly distributed. The Filmed Live Musicals website contains information on nearly 200 musicals that have been captured live. Check it out at filmedlivemusicals.com. And now, on with the show. Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast. I'm your host, Luisa Lyons, and my guest today is award-winning playwright, actor, musician, and teacher Jack Canfora. Jack trained at Lambda and has performed widely with a focus on Shakespearean roles. As a writer, his plays have been performed around the US and off-Broadway. Two of those plays, Jericho and The Source, each won an Edgerton Playwriting Award. His web series, The Small Time, won a Webby Award for Best Writing in a Web Series. And during the theater shutdown in 2020, Jack formed the New Normal Rep, a new digital theater company. Welcome, Jack.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Luisa. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm very excited to chat with you today. So to start us off, what made you fall in love with theater?
Well, gosh, a lot of things. I think that I moved around a lot as a kid. And so I was always sort of, from the outside looking in. I was always the odd man out. And I think I was also a little strange as a kid. And so I would have been the odd man out anyway. And, but I got to be in some school plays early on, and it was, really the only place where I thought, oh, I can sort of do this. And it was the only place where I was getting attention in a positive way from my peers. And so I think I fell in love with that before I fell in love with the actual art of it. And I think to a degree that still holds true in that only in so much as I really love being part of a team, feeling part of a small community. And there's nothing more, intensely tight knit than a company of actors. And so I've always just wanted to be a part of that.
Oh yes, community is so important, and especially the theater community. It's such a special place to be.
Absolutely. And there are also often sort of, in the best possible sense, misfits, who aren't, they're the sensitive ones who weren't necessarily super popular in high school and something. And I think that makes them, frankly, more interesting people down the line. So I think there's a certain kinship that so it's nice to see people of, like minds.
Yeah. When you were traveling around, were you traveling around the US a lot as a kid?
The US and also the UK for a year when I was about 10, which is just old enough to appreciate the fact that to understand and have it obvious to you that your culture is different in some key ways, but not old enough to really love that fact. I felt, I went back to England years later to study and am in fact sort of an unrepentant Anglophile. But when I was 10, I just knew that they didn't, televise baseball games. And that was very exciting to
me. Very important.
Yeah.
Were your parents in the army?
No, my father was in the banking world, which sounds vague and vaguely nefarious, but it wasn't nefarious. And he just kept on, getting sort of moving up the ladder. And so they moved him from New York to Chicago to Cincinnati to New York to London, back to New York. So that was all before I was 12. So
oh, wow.
That's a little discombobulating. And so took me a while to get combobulated again.
Yeah. As you were growing up, were you exposed to a lot of live theater apart from what you had at school?
Which is, well, no is the answer. And it's kind of remarkable. My parents are both very educated and very intelligent and kind people, but it just wasn't part of their world. And here's the thing. I lived about an hour outside of Manhattan from the age of 12 forward. I mean, really, you can't think of a more advantageous spot from which to attend theater. And yet it was just not it just was never on their radar. And therefore wasn't really on mine until, I want to say high school is the first time I wanted to go see a play or two, a musical or so. And in fact, my first recollection, and I was studying acting too in college at this point, but it was a spring break of college. And I was home one day and I forget what channel was showing it, but they were showing a live recorded version of A Long Day's Journey into Night.
Mm.
starring Jack Lemmon with the Jack Lemmon cast, and I think it had Peter Gallagher as Edmund and Kevin, what's his name, as Jamie, and it was transformative. I'd never seen a play at that point of such magnitude performed, and
Mm.
it just grabbed me in a way that I didn't realize I was capable of being grabbed. And Ben, you can edit that any way you like, but I mean, it just got me by the throat, sort of, and hasn't let go to a degree.
Mm. Did you seek out other recorded theater after watching that A Long Day's Journey
I
into Night?
did occasionally. I mean, the fact of the matter was, you see, I grew up. I mean, I'm 53, so that's the term was, I think, old. And back in my day, after getting back from school on horseback, I would the opportunities for
Uphill both ways.
film, yeah, uphill both ways in the snow, in the heat of summer,
Yes.
and pass President Lincoln on the street and say hello. So yeah, there just weren't that many opportunities, and it was fairly primitive. I remember watching, and this is a little bit older now. I'm out of college, and I'm actually trying to work as an actor, and occasionally succeeding, but not really. And I remember Bravo, before it became a Real Housewives enabler, showed I think it wasn't live from the stage, but I think it was a British TV recorded version of the play Look Back in Anger, with Kenneth
Mm.
Branagh and Emma Thompson. And I was fascinated by that play. I mean, I look back on it now and I find it sort of unbearable. But it wasn't the play so much. It was the production and the acting, and again, it was just this notion of a play being done on television in this case, because the difference between a television script and a play script is subtle but profound, and just the continuity of action and the privileging of dialogue and language were really attractive to me. And this is before I started
Mm.
trying to write, but so there I was definitely sucked in by it. And when I look at now, I mean, now I have National Theater, my National Theater Live app, and it's just to me, I mean, there's been a real revolution in the past. I think, and you would know better than I, but I would say in like the last 10 to 5 years, even, about how the quality of the production quality of these live works. So that's very exciting to me.
It's really interesting that you mentioned Brava because those all of the broadcast networks and the cable networks, they
Yeah,
were
yeah,
all investing at some point, like even if it was briefly, in
mm,
filming live theater, whether it was filming it in the theater or like
mm,
doing a TV adaptation. So it's interesting how that all folds into the history of it.
yeah.
So did you study acting in the US before you went to Lambda?
I did. I was my parents were very supportive, and still are. So I'm not trying to this is because it's going to sound harsh, but I think very practical. My father was a banker, my mother's a nurse, and so they were very enthusiastic and supportive of my acting. But they said, "Yeah, but you got to get a what they would call a real major." Said you're not gonna, you can be in theater, you can do all that all you want, and in fact, after you graduate, you're welcome to do that. But we need you to have a major that will make you employable. And so I studied acting in college, although not as a major, but I went to a couple of colleges that just fortunately didn't mandate you be a theater major to get to act in work, which was a godsend to me. And so, yeah, in college, I studied it. And then right after college, I took this Shakespearean intensive active class in Greenwich Village, run by the former head of RADA, and
Mm.
it was great and transformative to me, and let me in on a whole different way of looking at acting, in a very British through a British lens, which was great because in my first monologue was from Romeo and Juliet, and I just left my guts out on the stage and poured my heart into it, and he was so nice in only the way the British can be, but so cutting at the same time. And he said, "Well, I really believed every moment of that, and that you really were desperate and beyond, and just quite transported from yourself with grief. But of course, I don't care. Your job as an actor isn't to feel anything; it's to make us feel something." And I thought, well, I've been taken down a peg, and also what a fascinating perspective on acting, which you wouldn't hear in a lot of other classes in New York City, right? It's in fact antithetical.
Mm.
So at the end of which, but he was actually very supportive, and at the end of which suggested that I try and study in London for a while, and I did, and it was a great experience. It was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that
Jeez.
was great. I also studied theater in London, so I feel your feelings.
Yeah, it's a whole different take, right? And that's my own pet
Mhm.
theory, since you didn't ask, my own pet theory as to why the generation of actors, starting with, say, Daniel Day-Lewis and Gary Oldman and Emma Thompson, are so compellingly good, because they grew up watching De Niro and Pacino and Meryl Streep and these wonderful, and of course Brando, and these wonderful sort of method actors. And so they have all that emotional investment, but they also were taught the technique that British theater just assumes. I mean, British theater, I think, just assumes that you are capable of accessing these emotions, and that you're, oftentimes just a walking wound. But what they do is they insist that you learn craft, right, and learn technique
Mm.
in a way that maybe some, and I'm talking in horrible generalities here, that at least when I was a kid, that the important thing was to feel. The British theater teachers I dealt with said, "Yeah, we take it for granted you can feel. But this is a
Mm.
craft rather than an exercise in therapy." So, I mean, I don't know
Uh,
if you found it to be the same way.
I think drama school for me was a mix of therapy and
Right,
it was,
ideally, right?
yeah, mix of therapy
Yeah.
and technique, and it was like, opening myself up every day and then going home and processing.
Yeah, and going out, to the pub afterwards with friends. That's where a lot of the psychology happened, and some technique. But but yeah, no, exactly. And they were, and but I loved it. I mean, I did love it, and I even loved the way he would be charmingly cutting, with, with me, that sort of dry, you know, way. So I found it to be a very transformative experience, and I focused entirely on Shakespearean acting for that time, and I just fell in love with it, and so that was really the course I tried to go on.
Mm. I love the founder of the RSC, John Barton, talks about how Americans are really great at Shakespeare because there's a theory that the accent that
Yes.
British people had during the time of Shakespeare was closer to what the American accent is today.
Yeah, yeah, that's I've heard that too, and I've heard him on YouTube clips trying to imitate what they think it sounded like, and it sounds like more like a Irish Cornish American hybrid kind of, and it's fascinating to watch him do that stuff.
Yeah, it's so great. So, speaking of Shakespeare and writing, what drew you to writing?
Well, let's not set me up against him, but what the only thing we may have had in common, um, have in common, is that I think, like a lot of playwrights, we both started off as actors, right? And then, which to me, in some ways, is like the best training for a playwright, because the carpentry of it, and by that I mean sort of the architecture, the out, like this, the bones of a play, or what makes, or and there are varieties of them, to be sure, but they sort of seep in through osmosis. You sort of become sort of embedded in your DNA, so you don't have to necessarily map out, well, what does a successful play need, in a sort of dry and didactic and programmatic way. You just sort of um, become, it's just second nature to you in terms of what a play should feel like, structurally at least.
Mm.
um, and what when I did come back to America, and I did work, which was, I did work, but not in huge places. I was inevitably employed either in small Shakespearean companies, or oddly enough, improv comedy, which is like a very odd mixture of of two branches of acting. And from the improv, started writing sketch comedy, and so I was with a sketch group that played in the Village. See, I'm so cool. I just say the Village, in Greenwich Village, in the late '90s, turn of the century, um, and every week we'd have to come up with an hour's worth of new material. Or that's not true. Every 2 weeks we have to come up with an hour's worth of material. And there's really three guys in the whole group who were writing. And so, but it was the best writing training ever because you'd, especially with comedy, because there's no ambiguity in an audience's reactions to comedy. And so you'd write it and then you'd put it right up on its feet and it would work or it would not work. And so you would find out very quickly. You'd get immediate feedback from the audience. And so I would, again, not always consciously, but often consciously, figure out, oh, well, I can't do this so well, but I seem to be able to kind of do this. And so let me lean into this and pursue this more. So that was great training for me. And so that's what got me into writing it. And then I got married and was, my wife at the time was going to have a child, and he was going to want to eat every day, and so I thought it best to get a day job, and several times a day, by the way, as it turns out. And uh, so I figured, well, I should probably get some sort of job in addition to this, and so I became a teacher for many years, which I really loved. But it also basically killed my acting career, such as it was. Nipped it in the bud because it really became impractical to pursue auditions, et cetera, et cetera. But what it did make me lean into was writing, because I could write from home, and that was my way of sort of staying connected. And really, I think that's what drove me to it. And I think after time, I thought, well, I think I can. I seem to be getting good feedback. I think I can do this reasonably well, and so that became further incentive for me to continue.
Oh, that's so cool. And what were you teaching?
English, high school English, mostly AP literature, which was also a great teacher for me as a writer. Because the old cliche, but if you want to learn something, teach it. It allowed me to really deepen my relationship with language, which sounds weird and almost creepy the way I phrase that. But it got me more attuned to things, and especially with the plays. And we would go over a lot of plays that were by definition sort of classic, iconic works. And so I would get under the hood, so to speak, of like what Tennessee Williams is doing and what Arthur Miller, was doing, and Albee, and largely, although I tried to remedy this, Lorraine Hansberry also too, and August Wilson, especially as I started closing out my teaching career, really did a lot of August Wilson, in part because I was very aware of that these are all dead white men, but also because of August Wilson is just, to me, one of the greatest poets. He and Tennessee Williams, I think, they're the greatest American poets in theater. And so, really just sitting back in admiration and a sort of awe of all these works. I mean, it was great, again, to learn the structure and to figure out why something works and why something doesn't. And again, it's more, ultimately becomes more intuitive than anything, but, and it was just, and again, a great teacher. And also it was great that it set such a high bar. I mean, you go into every play you're going to write thinking, well, I hope this is going to be as good as, Death of a Salesman or Ma Rainey's Black Swan. and of course, it's not gonna be, but that's okay. That's you should reach, for the furthest possible goal you can, and knowing that it's okay that you're probably not going to get there, but you should try it anyway. And so it was just a wonderful. That was just a wonderful experience for me too as a writer.
You touched on briefly earlier about the subtle difference between playwriting and screenwriting. Was that
Yeah.
something that you were thinking about as you were investigating your own writing?
Well, first of all, I seem incapable of touching on anything briefly, but well, I mean, I'd love to write for television or even movies because of what's the word, money, and also I think television is being, I mean, I've said a lot of times in theater, the playwright gets utter control. You can't change a comma without my approval, and that's the sort of consolation prize they give you instead of money. And in I think in television and film, it's probably the reverse. But I do know that my writing style lends itself more naturally to theater, I think, than screenplays, because although I just watched a classic movie last night for the first time, Woman of the Year, which is a Hepburn Tracy movie. And once you get past the stunning sexism and casual racism, is what you're left with is a fascinatingly sort of quick, literate, dialogue heavy script, which wouldn't really fly for the most part today. And nowadays, language is cut so close to the bone, it becomes almost like a necessary evil, I think, in most screenplays. And I have to say that I have a tremendous weakness for thinking visually. And of course, it's really, in a lot of ways, I guess it's the director who really writes the movie in a way because they're controlling the narrative.
Mm.
Um, so plays and also plays seem more realistic to me, because I've done plays, so as so it's not impossible for me to imagine writing a play. Um, being on a movie set, or well, they wouldn't let the writer on the movie set, but having these connections, etc., to get your screenplays and at such scene, it's a different order of magnitude, and in a weird way, a very different experience. I would think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I would think novelists in some ways are more naturally suited to be screenplay writers than playwrights. And I'm speaking generally here, and there are lots of exceptions, but novelists often tell a story imagistically, and there are a lot of great playwrights who have a great gift for that as well. I'm just not one of them.
So this is really interesting, bringing us to new normal rep, fast forwarding in your career to 2020, and this idea of online theater.
Mm.
So what do you think online? I know this is a giant can of worms, but what do you think online theater is?
Well, it obviously it varies, and but what what we had done, and the company almost came about by accident in a way, because about a month into the pandemic, I reached out to friends of mine who almost entirely actors, and whom I'd worked with, and who were not only really excellent actors, but really people I enjoyed hanging out with, and it was just a way of sort of spending time with people socially. And so I wrote to them and said, why don't we just do a play reading group every week? And it can be any play, and anyone can play any role. We don't care. And it's just really fun to do and to keep our muscles in some sort of shape, and just really to connect with people. Again, it's the connection thing. And a few months into it, a few of us realized this is actually a pretty solid company of actors. And we'd also watched that time, as I think a lot of us did, a lot of attempts at doing online plays, which is different than certainly film. And so what those things would inevitably be, I found, certainly in the early months, even with remarkable talent in major institutions behind them, they would either be live, like filmed live, shows, some of which were good and some of which weren't, or they would be actors in their apartments reading scripts. And don't get me wrong, I enjoyed that, but we started to think, well, there's got to be a way of doing it that's a little less so obviously not a theatrical experience. And so we were lucky we put together the company, as best we could, and we started the season, and we said early on, well, we want it to be different than that. We don't want it to be just actors in their apartments, although technically that was the case, but we wanted to make it look like it wasn't the case. And so our first play of our season was a play directed by Marsha Mason, and she was wonderful, and she's terrific and brilliant as a director and an actor. But she said, I really don't know what we're doing. I've never done this. And I said, well, almost no one has. And that's kind of the fun and the terror of it. And so we sort of landed on an aesthetic for giving, with green screens, etc., of allowing the actors to seem like they're in the same place. I mean, we get it. It's the audience isn't going to be fooled by that per se, but within a couple of minutes, we found that audiences would just buy into that premise, would buy into that reality. And we always decided to do direct address. Every scene was played as direct address, not to the audience, but to the other characters. And what we found was, as that aesthetic sort of developed, it it made you feel like you were in the scene. A lot of viewers said it felt like I'm like actually on the stage in the scene, and it's at times a little intense, and it's also kind of compelling. So it's a different, a very different. And the word that people kept on using was a sort of more almost intimate experience, because you're so physically close, and the actor, even though he or she may be talking to someone, another is clearly talking to another character and not you, but they're looking at you. And so,
Mm.
and again, we don't think it is theater, the exact correlation to theater, but we think it's a theatrical experience, and it's about plays. And again, like I was saying earlier, it privileges language in a way that is sort of antithetical to movies, etc. So we have found, I think, and we continue to improve on it. We did 4 plays in the season, and we got very good feedback, and it became sort of exciting, because we're still learning, and everyone's still learning, but it's kind of a brand new form, and I don't think it's going away entirely, regrettably, but also maybe not. And what we became really excited about as it went on was the notion that this is sort of democratizing theater in a way it hasn't been democratized in forever, because getting to see a play on Broadway or even off Broadway these days is prohibitively expensive for many
Mhm.
people, i.e., me,
Mhm.
and and I think that's true for everyone. And also, it's a geographic problem. People can be, or often, literally thousands of miles away, or hundreds and hundreds of miles away from really high quality professional theater. But now you can watch something akin to that for very little money, if any money at all. A good artistic director would know how much these tickets cost, but I think, we had subscription packages, but like if you didn't, I think the most you paid was like $20. Or and if you were a student or another theater artist, you'd only paid like 10. And we sort of had a pay what you can sort of approach to it. And for example, this new audio play that we did, it's free, because we just wanted anyone to have access to it who had access to the internet.
I love that. Would love to talk more about the democratizing arts. I love your like your mission statement, dedicated to democratizing the arts, providing high quality, progressive theatrical content from diverse voices for all. Can you speak? You just did a little, but could you
Hmm.
unpack a little bit more how you think digital theater will make theater more accessible?
Well, yeah, I think just by offering it to people, I think there are communities, and I would argue it's, and I'm making this number up, like 90 to 95% of America has no real relationship to theater. In other words, they don't, they don't see plays, and if they do, it's the occasional musical, which is wonderful, but that's just a section of theater. um, and they just don't. And it's not because it's not on their map. It's not on their radar at all. And so I think by exposing people to this experience, I think a lot of people will really come to love it, and because we all love theater. The people who are exposed to it 9 times out of 10 sort of fall in love with it, and I think it's a very so I think if you give theater a chance to be seen by people, it will do all the heavy lifting. That's all. That's really all that it needs. Assuming, and I think we've been successful. Assuming you can produce work that is interesting and compelling, and which is a challenge because people are sick of staring at their screens all the time. So you have to give them a
Mm.
reason to not view it as a Zoom meeting. It can't feel like a Zoom meeting. Um, and so that's one of the ways we can do that. And I don't think it is in any way at odds with live theater. I mean, all of us are writers and actors in our company and directors who love the theater and want to. And that was my dog shaking his bone. Um, and we want to and do continue to work in live theater. We don't want it to replace it, but to use a weird, second time I'm mentioning baseball today, it's weird, analogy is baseball. Major League Baseball in the 1930s started broadcasting the games on the radio, and in the 50s they started doing it on television. And both times the owners were really against it. They said, why would anyone go to the theater, go to a ballpark, if they can just listen to it or watch it? And in fact, it was the opposite. Attendance at ballparks exploded because all of a sudden there were lots of people being exposed to it that didn't have the chance. And they said, well, I really think I'd love to drive in and see a ball game in real life. That would be fun. And I think it's
Mm.
sort of the same thing with anything, but certainly with theater here, where you're allowing a lot of people exposure to theatrical work. And I think it would only whet their appetites.
I totally. And as you were talking, it was funny. I was also thinking about sport and thinking about how
Mm,
across the US, sport is so accessible because it's on a bazillion channels and it's playing
right.
24/7 and you can access any level of game.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
what I love about digital theater is that we can do that for theater. There's the potential to do that. And it
Exactly.
won't just be centralized on Broadway anymore. It can
Yes.
be from Long Island, or it can be from Chicago, or like
Or
middle
Nebraska,
town
or
somewhere.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
wherever. I mean, and I think that's a beautiful thing. I can't think of a reason that's not a good thing.
Mm,
And I think that the theater community at large, I think, would be really well served in the long term by investing in communities, be they rural or just suburban, or different demographics, communities of color and inner cities and outer cities, and exurbs, blah blah. You name the demographic. None of us, no matter what cohort we belong in, for the most part, we don't really have much access to theater. It's not part of our daily cultural conversation,
mm.
except among our theater friends. So if you can make it a tiny part of that, that's going to be great for theater, and it's going to sort of allow enforce theater to not be so much of a fortress on the hill with these huge high gates in the form of ridiculous ticket prices.
To kind of expand on what we were saying earlier, that it opens up the community. It's not a gated community
Yeah.
anymore. It becomes an open community.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Beautifully put.
Why, thank you.
Yeah, and
What
you
do you
did it
think
in
are
one
the
sentence, which I'm incapable of doing.
what do you think are the challenges of creating online theater?
Well, I mean, and there's no shortage of them. I mean, there's never a theatrical endeavor that isn't up to its neck in challenges, right? Um, the I mean, the fact that it is not theater, right? I mean, the fact that you have to sort of buy into the aesthetic, and I think that you have to. Um, I think a lot of it's just grabbing the audience, or getting the audience to give it a chance, right? If you
Mm,
can see that, oh, this is different than what I watch on Netflix, and what I watch on Netflix is great, but or the movies, and that's great too. But this is slightly different, and this is bringing something to the table, which is again plays and a theatrical experience, but not in a theater. And so, one of the things I love most about theater is the aliveness and the ephemeral nature of it, which is part of why it's great and part of why it's frustrating at times. But um, it's this organic, symbiotic. Those are the only science terms I know. Relationship between an audience and an actor and a cast, and they feed off each other, right? And it's the
mm.
symbiotic thing. And sometimes it's not always a pleasant symbiotic thing, but it is a symbiotic thing, and that's missing in this. And so I think that's a challenge. And I think the way to get through that to a degree, for the audience anyway, which is whom we're there to serve, is in fact to make it a little bit more intimate, and to make you feel like I've said earlier, people have said, like, you're in the middle of the play in a way that you don't feel like there's no distance between what you and what you're watching, as there is in other
Mm.
mediums. And so I think that's a way of compensating for it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. In preparing for the works that you've done with New Normal Rap Jericho, Two Sisters and a Piano, Lines in the Dust, and is it Fire or Fire?
Fire.
Fire.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
no.
what was the process in putting all of those together?
Well, we wanted to we try to budget it, and as best we can. We figured we could maybe, with our funds, put on 4 shows, um, and that could be spread out over the course of a season, which we thought was a fair amount. And we also do readings, which is a very different thing. But the shows, and again, it was a learn as you go process. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to have shows that did reflect diversity, but not for diversity's sake, um, but because these are just great stories and great scripts and great directors who deserve to be heard. And part of our mission too is we're going to do new, but also maybe underappreciated, underproduced plays that we think have a lot of value. And so we were, very lucky. We were able to get Nilo Cruz, who's won the Pulitzer for Anna in the Tropics, and he has a play, very worthy play, very good play called Two Sisters and a Piano, which he really is close to him, and it's been produced, but it hasn't gotten the widespread attention say to Anna in the Tropics has, and he not only obviously is the writer, but he also wanted to direct it. So we said great, and so because of that, Jimmy Smits was eager to do it, and Daphne Rubin Vega, and it was a wonderful performance of a very good play. And again, talking to an experience that many of, or from a perspective that certainly me as a suburban white guy, I'm not as familiar with as I would like to be, and I felt like I really got immersed in that experience. We were able to reach out to a brilliant actress and I believe she's won an Obie actually, and also a great writer. She was nominated for a Pulitzer, so I really wouldn't mind having her resume. But her name is Nicole Salter, brilliant writer who wrote a really compelling, fascinating play. She's an African American woman, and she wrote a play about what people in disadvantaged communities economically sometimes have to do and are willing to do to get their children into so-called better schools, of more affluent communities. And it's a three-person play, two women of color and a white man. The white man plays someone who is a private detective whose specialty is finding out people who shouldn't be in the school district. And one of Nicole's gifts as a writer is that this guy whose job, just at first, glance strikes us as maybe loathsome, but he's not a cartoon character. He's got a point of view, and he raises good points. And she treats everyone with such humanity and complexity, and also complicity in what's all going on. That was a really hard play to watch in the best sense of that phrase. You know what I mean? Because it was, once you started watching it, you couldn't stop watching it, but it forced you to really look at the world in a very, an issue in the world in a very human and complex way. And the other play, the final play, Fire, which has little periods at the end of every letter. So it's also an acronym, but it's by a woman whom I've known for years as a friend, but who is a brilliant relatively young to me anyway, playwright named Julia Blauvelt, who just recently graduated from NYU's writing program. It's hysterically funny, but also really tackling a serious issue. It's the premise is a group of people working in a hedge fund they're all excited to go out to their annual summer get together from the company, but they can't because something has come up with one of the big hedge funds they manage, and there's clearly some numbers that have been fudged, and so they have to stay in the office. And it's hysterically funny, but also the ideas of what that culture is like and what the morality is of shifting all this money and justifying shifting all this money is about. And it's so lightly handled. I mean, I don't mean lightly handled in the sense that it wasn't taken seriously, but just it wasn't polemical in any way. So it's just such a great
Delicate
script.
touch.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's so good. And so we were
Is
very
it
proud
giving
of her.
anything away if you share the acronym?
Well, well, if I can remember it, it's really good, and it's a real acronym that she had heard because she worked as a receptionist as but it ends financial, let's say ink spot, but that doesn't make sense. Retire early. In other words, it's an acronym that these guys would use. I'm so ashamed I can't remember it. That basically said you got to sort of absolutely ruthlessly regulate your life financially, and always plan, always get an extra buck, squeeze an extra buck out where you can, and not care necessarily about the consequences, certainly not think about them. And in all, the goal is, to retire earliest with the most money. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to think about, but it's that prioritizing that is really the only sort of, the organizing principle of your existence is obviously both alluring and problematic. And so Julia really, is just wonderful in dealing with that.
Having just I've been binge watching Inventing Anna on
Oh my
Netflix,
God.
and
Yes. Exactly
it's
right. Exactly right.
so
Exactly
with your
right.
setups for these programs, these plays, what was the technical setup, and how did you film them?
Very good question. We had, well, like I said, we had green screens, and we eventually got a video designer for the first play, which is Jericho, which is one of mine, because I'm not entirely without ego, obviously. So I'd like a play of mine to be in it too. And it was actually a restaging of a play that was off Broadway, and was clear to me early on that a lot of this was just going to be over my head, and I just hired really smart, good people at that. But it involved green screens, obviously, and a sort of a video design or projection design, um, to make it look as connected, in each actor's home as possible. High quality mics that we rented, special cameras that we rented, and also a device that allowed the script to be visible to the actor at all times, and
Mm.
so that they uh, didn't have to get off book, although we rehearsed and they were very familiar with the scripts, obviously. But freed of that obligation of having to get off book, they really, rehearsal time could be compressed, which is also economically and a blessing, and also in terms of people like Daphne Urban Vega and Jimmy Smits, whose days are pretty busy. It was They were able to get them in to do it, but it would also lent to that idea of looking right into the screen, because they are you know um, looking at you and acting at you, but they also have the words very handy, and it scrolled along. So that to me was the hugest technical problem to be overcome. And because the thing that always drove me nuts, I remember watching early on a very well, the rereading of the screenplay of The Princess Bride, with most of the original cast, which I loved, and I loved their performance of it, their Zoom reading of it. But it was laggy, and it was them reading off pages, and and that's the sort of the first time I thought to myself, wow, Rob Reiner and these guys are brilliant, and they don't really know what they're doing. They're sort of playing it by ear, because if they're playing it by ear, everyone must be playing it by ear. And if everyone's playing it by ear, there's got to be a better way of figuring out how to, do this. And a lot of the technical innovations that made it possible, I take zero credit for. I am technically rated as Amish, and so so it's done, it's not something I can do, but and we improved on it. And East Jericho was the first one we did. And I think it really achieved a lot of that. And with each iteration, I think we got a little bit smarter and a little bit, we're able to, smooth away some of the edges of it.
Was each actor filmed like as their own entity, and then you would splice it together? Like,
No,
how did
no,
they
no, no,
play
no,
off
no.
each
We would
other?
film, and this is another way it was, like the theatrical experience. You would have everyone linked up and acting together, and they could see the other actor on the screens.
Huh.
And so they were looking at the other actor, just like, and so they could use eye contact and facial cues or nonverbal cues to enrich their scenes and help each other out.
Whoa, that's like the logistics of it just perpetually blow my mind.
Yeah, it's better for me not to think about it, and just to be grateful. I mean, Marsha Mason was really important and helpful in figuring out just art, aesthetically how to do it. And I had a small hand in that, but it was really other people who are, other actors, other members of the company, and we all sort of collaborated on that. But the technical vision of it, was definitely not in my wheelhouse, and so I was happy to have smart people work on it for us. And and you can watch Jericho. The listeners of this podcast can, because for the listeners of this podcast, um, and this podcast only, you can log on to our website, which I'm be provided, I'm sure, but it's newnormalrep.org, and then you'd backslash bonus, and then you would be sent to a link, and the password would be NNR 2022, and then you would have access to free access to Jericho to see what we mean.
Wonderful. And we will make sure to have links to that in the show notes. What do you think is going to be the future of this hybrid form of theater and film?
Um, I can't say. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to lie and say, well, I feel confident it'll go in this direction or other direction. I do. The only thing I'm confident in is that it's not going to go away. Very few new media forms entirely disappear. I think there may be different, and it will inevitably evolve and come out new iterations. But I do think it's for the reason we talked about earlier about democratizing theater and giving more people access to dramatic work. I think it's going to continue. And getting back earlier to what we talked about filmed live musicals, and again, you can speak to this better than I can. I mean, isn't the quality of the experience exponentially better than it was even 10 years ago? Or am I wrong about that?
I think it's changing. I think it's more accessible. I
Yeah.
think like the kind of the major captures like from PBS and
Mm,
like the Broadway and West End captures have always been like kind of amazing quality,
right.
given what they had. But I
Right.
think what's great is that the technology is just making it more and more accessible for more people to do it. It's you don't have to be
Indeed.
PBS anymore. You don't have to be
Right.
nationally funded to be able
Right.
to stream your work.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, we're obviously a case in point, but I would also think, and I'm asking this out of curiosity, but I mean, the fact that it's a lot of these great works were videotaped, and now they're digitally recorded. That removes some of the distance people had often complained about videoing theater work, and also there's more cameras that can be incorporated more subtly, more camera angles. I just think it's bound to continue to improve, and my experience of that is the national theater in Britain's of their channel, basically, which 5 seconds into any show I've watched there, I forget about the fact, oh yeah, I'm not in the theater, obviously. Um, and you just focus on that story. And I find myself drawn in almost the same way I would be in a theater.
Mm. Yeah, it's preaching to the choir. I love watching theater on screen. It's,
Yeah.
it is a different way to experience it. It's not a replacement, as I, always love to say.
Yeah.
It's not a replacement. It's an alternative, and it just, as we've talked about, opens up the doors. It
Yeah.
it allows more
It's
people.
I think has its own merits in itself, but at worst, I think it serves as a gateway drug to real theater.
Yeah. Oh yes. Absolute gateway drug. I see that we're running a little short on time, so
Oh,
here's our final segment. It's called My Favorite Things, where I ask you my favorite question.
These are a few of my favorite things.
I usually about musical, but you're welcome to use plays or theater in general. Do you
okay.
have a
Thank you.
favorite musical or play?
Um, my sentimental favorite musical is Guys and Dolls, because A, I think Frank Lesser was an unappreciated genius, and B, it was the first play I got cast in high school as a lead, and so it's forever close to my heart. Um, and I actually played Sky Masterson, so it was the only time in high school I got to pretend to be cool, and everyone on stage had to pretend to think I was cool. So you can't take away that memory. My favorite play, it varies. I mean, I can give you, a short list. I think Long Day's Journey into Night is about as as good as human drama gets, and I'm talking in the non-Shakespeare category. Um, um, the Real Thing by Tom Stoppard is beautiful. Uh, I think the Crucible. I think Streetcar Named Desire, Cat and How to Improve. Also, I think August Wilson's Cycle, particularly Fences and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, just kills me every time.
Mm.
And also, I think The Real Inspector Hound is hilarious. And of course, Noise is Off. I don't know that it's capable to laugh more without endangering yourself than watching a good production of that.
We love a good farce.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have a favorite filmed live show?
Well, I do, but I don't know that your audience will. I mean, it qualifies technically, but I don't think many of your musical audience will be like, I don't think that really counts. Is Bruce Springsteen live on Broadway?
Totally counts. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's a guy who plays baseball in football stadiums. He plays to 30, 40, 50,000 people, and he's playing to a house of a few hundred, or several hundred. But and also in the camera is just it's so much it's so intimate, and he's actually, just as it turns out, a brilliant storyteller. That it's very compelling, and you get really beautiful stripped down versions of his music. And which is a unique song experience for a Springsteen fan, which I am, and I just think they use the medium both in the theater itself and also as a filmed piece of work. I think they used it perfectly.
What a great example, and a great choice. A filmed live musical is not exactly a stage show, and it's not exactly a film. So, what should we call it?
Filmed live musical.
Or a filmed. Let's say digital theater. It's not quite theater, and it's not quite film. So, what should we call it?
A digital.
I like that. Where do you stand on bootlegs?
I am generally opposed because I think artists are grossly underpaid. I sort of hypocritically turn a blind eye to situations in which that are maybe plays or musicals by vast corporate entities in which all the stars are very, very, very comfortable. And also, if the play is not on anymore and there's no way to see it anymore, and yes, these artists still deserve credit and money for their work, but if it's someone who's ungodly rich in a corporation that doesn't need this to survive in any way, I'm a little bit more lenient on that. But in general, and it giveth and it taketh away, right? Because it's not good for artists to not be paid what they're worth. They almost inevitably aren't, or at least be paid something for their work. On the other hand, I think you're exposing again, thousands and tens of thousands of people to an experience they would not otherwise have access to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I didn't really answer that question. And
you absolutely answered it.
I don't know. It's sort of shoulder shrug. Yeah.
It's not black and white. It's very,
Indeed,
very nuanced.
Yeah.
What stage shows would you like to see filmed in the future?
Ooh, that's really good. Well, Angels in America was done at the National and filmed at the National, so that would have been the one that I would have lobbied for. I would love to see a great staged version of Death of a Salesman, which is running now with an not all, but mostly African-American cast, which is a fascinating and I think very good choice to make. There's the television version, film for TV version of that with Dustin Hoffman, which is great. But I think I would love to see that on stage, particularly because it's sort of a stream of consciousness kind of theater, which was sort of a brand new idea at that time. And to see it staged in that way, that's a great example of theater or any art form using its restrictions to be more creative, which is what I think Kazan did with that play and Miller. And so I'd love to see what they did with that. And I think that would be a great one to be filmed.
Oh, I love that choice. Yes, please. Finally, where can we find you online?
Well, first of all, the name of my theater company is New Normal Rep, or NNR, and you can follow us on Twitter at New Normal. You can find us. Our website is newnormalrep.org. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Jack Canfora, and I also have a Facebook page, which is Jack Canfora. You sense a lack of imagination here, and I think that more or less covers where I can be found. And also, crucially here, the audio play Step 9, which we didn't really get a chance to talk about, was it's our first foray into audio plays. We're very proud of the work. It's a very compelling, I hope, drama about a woman who is confronted by someone trying to make amends for a traumatic, horrible incident a trauma that he inflicted on her 30 years ago. And so she had sort of put it behind her, and now it's back in the forefront. And it's about how she and her mother and her daughter, who are all ardent feminists, view this, how she should handle this in such radically different ways. So it's a generational look at that. And it sounds heavy, and it is heavy, but it's also got jokes, and the performances are amazing. And so I really hope people will check that out. And it's completely free. And it's on, you can go to our website and get a link to it, or you can visit any of your local favorite podcast platforms and type in New Normal Rep in Step 9, and you can have free access to that. So I'm really hoping people will check that out, because, again, talk about democratizing theater, is literally free. And so I really hope people will check that out.
Love that. And we will have links to all of those in the show notes. Jack, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh my gosh, it flew by. Thank you so much for having me.
The Filmed Live Musicals podcast is created and edited by your host, Luisa Lyons. FilmedLiveMusicals.com is where musicals come home. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Shout out and all the thank yous to our wonderful patrons: Geraldine Brewer, Belinda Broido, Elliot Charles, Rachel Esteban, Mercedes Esteban Lyons, Hannah Graneman, James T. Lane, Allison Matthews, David Negrin, David and Catherine Rabinowitz, Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman, Joe Tillotson, and Beck Twist. Patrons generously provide financial support to preserve the history of film stage musicals and contribute to the curation of one easy place to find them all. If you would like to support the site, receive early access to this very podcast, and early access to site content, become a Filmed Live Musicals patron for as little as $3 a month. Visit filmedlivemusicals.com to learn more. If you like what you hear, please leave a review on Apple Music. It really helps get the word out about the show. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening.